All right, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Clemenz with a Z podcast. Roy here, and I got another segment in the We Were in a Cult series where we talk to former members of the ICOC about their life in it, out of it, trying to make sense of what it was, all this. Was it a cult? Was it not a cult? This big wild thing that we were in. I've got former member on here, Liz. What's up, Liz?
Hi,
Glad to have you on.
glad to be here.
Yeah. Um, so let's get right into it. So how'd you get into this thing? Were you met or were you a Kingdom kid?
I was definitely a Kingdom kid, and I was thinking a lot about when I've been listening to the other episodes, the hierarchy of Kingdom kids. And if your parents were like part of like in the Gimples living room, then you were like top of hierarchy, right?
Hmm.
And if they were at University of Florida, then they were like also really high in
Hmm.
hierarchy. Um, my parents were not either of those things, but they were in Tallahassee. So like back in the 70s. And so they met in the church in the 70s. They met up in Columbus and then they followed the couple that baptized them down here, down to Florida. And then they got married in Florida and then so be it. So I think that this was something that like something I've been thinking about a lot is this like who's in and who's out. The church
Hmm.
did that to a lot of us is like creating these categories and like, there's a lot
Yeah.
of judgment about people who weren't born into it and who if they were born into it like when their parents were in it. So um
Yeah. I could definitely see that. I always thought it was really cool that my parents were a part of it for as long as they were,
yeah.
you know. Because yeah, they were down in Tallahassee too. And they would drop names that they knew that you would hear on like KNN videos or like
Oh my gosh, yeah.
church plannings. Yeah.
What's funny, we talked about this in our initial email that like I don't think that we probably our parents lived in Tallahassee at the same time, but they must have known each other because it was a pretty
Hmm.
small circle. I mean, and they of course they were both in Atlanta from in the 80s. So,
Yeah.
but we weren't that connected.
Yeah, you were on the east side, I was on the west side. My parents more than likely knew who your family was because I felt like they knew everybody.
Well, there's no way that they didn't know who each other were. Like that, like
Yeah.
there's no way. Like,
Uh-huh. Oh, the
uh,
hierarchy. If you were in the Gimples living room, we're way cooler. Is it weird to be called the Kingdom Kid? I've never asked anybody that.
you know what? I think that okay. So there's this book that I would recommend to you and all your listeners called Cultish about like the
Cultish?
language of cults and how one of the first steps in creating a subculture is language that differentiates you from the outside.
Yeah.
And you see this in everything, not just cults. You see this in like spin classes and in organizations and schools and everything like that. But Kingdom Kid is one of our buzzwords. It's one of our differentiating language pieces. So I didn't mind it when I was growing up. It would be a Kingdom Kid or a Disciples Kid. I think that we used we because you say DK, I was a DK,
Hmm.
right? Um, but it's not language that is ever, I don't use it now. So it is like weird to revisit it, if that makes sense. Like even listening to
Oh,
these
yeah.
episodes, it's like all of these words that are so familiar, but that they're not in my language anymore. It's very weird. It's like returning to a language that I forgot I knew. Um, but
And
no,
then
I
if you,
never minded it because it made me feel like I was better than everyone else. And that's what you always wanted, right? You always wanted to be the
mhm,
best. Hmm.
wanted to be included, you wanted to feel like you were part of some inner circle and you were a Kingdom Kid. I liked it, but I also felt like people were harder on me, like I've said a couple of times when it came to like studying the Bible or stuff like that. Because I mean, we grew up knowing these things that people would come in from the outside, and it was just like this new wondrous thing for them. We're like, I mean, okay, I mean, it's just this. Yeah, we've been in it for so long, we know it.
I don't know. I think that like yeah, I don't know. It made me feel good about myself. It's this like I think one thing that the church like did that I'm still trying to move past is it really instilled a need for external validation, like this
Hmm.
affirmation that you're doing the right thing and that you're good and that you're okay. Um, and I think that like being a kingdom kid didn't mean that you were necessarily good, but it like, you had something there that you could like, well, at least I'm in
Hmm.
it, like seeped in
Yeah.
scripture.
Yeah, that external validation is really hard to let go of, because we had to hear from our disciplers or from the leaders that we're doing a good job,
Hmm.
you know, and that just translates to like our friends now or our significant others, you know. I find myself in that sort of mindset too. God, it's so hard to let go of that.
Well, actually, I think that like I would be interested to like do like some research with people who have left the church because I think it really primes you for abusive relationships is what it does.
Hmm.
Um, and I have never been in an abusive intimate partner relationship, but I had a therapist who towards the end it did feel kind of abusive because she was using a lot of this language that they would use in the church. Well, if you're not doing this and you're not, she would say like you're not invested in your healing and
Hmm.
you're not serious about working through your issues or whatever. Um, and it triggered me, but I wasn't aware enough to realize that it was like this so familiar because I knew that. I know that
Hmm.
like that dynamic. And I wonder if other people have experienced that too with therapists or people in power, bosses, other relationships, because it's so easy to slip back into that to look for their approval.
Hmm. I know the one thing that I think that's followed me is the sense that I'm smaller than everyone else,
Yeah.
in a sense
Mhm.
that like my bosses or like my principals that I've worked with at school, like they're bigger than me, and I have if there's a problem, it's always my fault. It's
Yep.
never theirs.
Yep.
Um, and that's sort of can lend to an abusive relationship there. Um,
Yeah.
mhm.
Well, and I
Yeah,
think
I've had some friends talk to me off this podcast about relationships that they had, that just they got out of church and then it was like two or they just didn't know how to be in a relationship. So
yeah,
they're just doing what we were taught,
right,
and they just got involved with a narcissistic person that
right.
just used it to their advantage.
Well, I think, and I think that this was definitely done explicitly to women. I think it was to men as well, to guys as well, but this like positing as like an overextension and a lack of boundaries, that's love.
Hmm.
Like, and you're just expected to like quote unquote serve people all the time. And
Hmm.
so I think that that is part of this too, right? And if you end up finding yourself a narcissist, that's really a bad scene.
Yeah, yeah, I think it definitely for, you guys were meant to serve us, i.e. the women were to serve the men.
Yeah,
Um, I think for us it was we're protectors, we're in charge.
right,
And I think that can be just as damaging in itself, because it just puts you in this place of I have to figure all of this out. And then when you get into that sense of I don't know what I'm doing, it just messes with your head and your heart so much because you feel like you're supposed to and you have to. In
right.
reality, you don't. But we were never taught those kind of things. And it's I remember one time I've joked with my wife, sometimes I'm just wish you just submit. It's that word submit is so like it's even hard for me to say like seriously, you know?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's one of those words someone in a non-church context, obviously, asked me if I could hold them accountable for something. And I was like,
No,
nope.
too much pressure. Oh God, no.
I was like, I can't use that word. Like, we're gonna have to find another choice. Like, what? I'm like, no, that's a trigger word. That's my church trigger word.
So right now, the first thing we're realizing at church has made us fear words.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Accountable. Oh geez, sharp. That word comes up so much that I just kind of like, whoa, just ugh.
Yeah.
Encouragement.
Encouragement. Mm-hmm. I mean, And I think that beyond like the normal words that we have, like rebuke, um, like there we had, of course, the this like sub language of like D time, D group,
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
quiet time, all of these things that like are specific vocabulary.
Hmm.
Uh,
Isn't it nice to be in a space where like you're saying these words and the other person is like, "Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about,"
yeah.
instead of
So my
having to like explain it for 10 minutes?
yeah, so you'll appreciate this. So my wife is finishing up her school, and she, for some assignment, she was in a class. She had to go visit another a place of worship, and she's like, "I'm going to visit your church, your old church," because they had a where we were living in Hawaii. And first of all, Anthony Galang was the preacher there, and I was like, "Oh my God, he's so famous! Like you don't even
I
know
was
how famous he is," right?"
I was literally about to ask, was it Anthony Galang's
Yep,
church?
it was. Um, but she uh she made a whole thing of notes for me um that was very funny to hear from her perspective.
Hmm.
She talked about the book table. Remember the book table?
Oh yeah. Hmm.
Mhm. Um
Or the
oh yeah,
tapes.
back when we had tapes and like radical love.
Oh yeah.
Talked about the other ones. I don't think anyone's talked about radical love. So I'm sorry if I
Um, Someone will have talked about this. No, I talked about it on a prior episode that hasn't been out yet. The Radical Love. Oh my gosh, that CD. Everybody had it.
but she said, there were so many like cultural signifiers that I hadn't even tuned into that she noticed like
Uh-huh.
she was getting side hugs from all the men. You know,
Yep.
there was a man that greeted her and said hello briefly, and then he passed her off to his wife, and the only people that talked to her from then on were women. Like, you know, three speakers all very personally sharing about their lives in a
Hmm.
weird way, talking about porn and masturbation. And
Oh my
using the
gosh, we
Bible as
talked
a
about
vehicle
that.
for addressing their struggles.
Wait, they talked about porn and masturbation in a service?
I guess they did. I know. I was like, oh, this is radical.
I know. We only talked about that when we broke up as men and women.
Yeah, right. Um,
Gosh.
she
Yeah, the
said
side hugs.
it was like very clear the appeal in it because she said that if I were new to this island and I didn't know anyone else and was looking for a church, I could see the appeal. She
Hmm.
said it made me want to believe in God, but I don't. Um, and then I think she's like she said there was a lot of like like everything was so clear and the rules were so clear. And she was
Uh-huh.
like, I could see how there would be a lot of comfort in that.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
and I've been thinking a little bit about like neurodivergence in the church and I wonder like the representation of people on the spectrum and people who have ADHD and all this are represented because it's like you need these structures to help you like exist and the church provides that for you, right?
It provided everything, a rule for everything.
Hmm.
Made it very clear,
Yep.
and that people do find comfort in that. And I mean, I did too for a while. You can wake up and know that I'm doing this, this, and this. Okay, I'm okay, right?
Yeah.
Mhm. That's so funny about the how she's greeted by a man. He talks to her for a second, and then it's like, okay, I can't talk to you anymore. Here's my wife.
Yep. Yep. And it's interesting because I think that like when we were connecting before the show, it's like we were in the same circles. We had the same
Yeah,
friends, but like you and I never like hung out. We didn't really talk, whatever. But it was because everything was so gendered. Like it was
yeah.
so
Hmm.
hard to have cross-gender friendships. Like you had to be really seeking it out in order to make that work, you know?
And it always felt a bit dangerous.
Mhm.
Um, it was like this, we're hanging out, we're by ourselves.
Oh, you
How
hung out
is
with
this good?
yourself by yourselves with girls. That's
Oh,
edgy,
yeah. I mean,
boy.
I met with coffee. I had some friends that were girls near the end, and we would meet up and have coffee. And there'd be a couple of friends of mine that would be like, "I don't know why you do that. That's weird." Um, And I always tried to push back on that, like, why is it weird?
Yeah.
I mean, there was a sense of like there was a sense of like attraction. I knew that there, but it was never like super on the forefront. It was just like, I think this girl's rad and I can have a conversation with her. But that's just kind of how I've always been. And it was
Right.
always that was always hard for me. Um, because it's always like you were always with the guys or you're always with the girls, and nary the two shall meet or intermingle, because if I start talking to a girl, then before you know it, we're not gonna be able to control ourselves, and then here we go, she's pregnant and our lives are ruined.
No, I mean, that was like an explicit message. Like that was not
Yeah.
like that was an explicit message we got. That wasn't implicit. That was like explicit. Like if you hang out by yourself with a boy, you will get pregnant. And I think that one of the things that I think a lot about is how our parents had no idea the messages that we were getting from these people in their early 20s who were in
Hmm.
charge of us, in the teens specifically. Like, you know, they, our parents, I don't know about your parents, but like my parents gave up a lot of control to the church. And
Yep. Hmm.
there was one family in the East that their I always thought it was weird at the time, but now I deeply respect them, that their dad and mom, they had like a very different set of rules. And they were like, no, like I don't trust 17-year-olds to supervise my child. Like you cannot drive across town to Devo on 285. Like that's not what you're doing. And so those girls got kind of left out of a lot of our stuff because they weren't really allowed to be in it with us.
Hmm.
But we just got this kind of loose framework. And then we had these teen workers interpreting it however they felt was best.
Yeah, or how they were told it
Right.
was gonna be like disseminated. Yeah, you bring up a good point where like everything was sort of, it was sectioned. So
Hmm.
like if you're in the teens, you're around the teens.
Yep. Yep.
You go to campus, you're around campus people. And then if you go into the dreaded singles ministry, um, you were always with single people. You were never hanging out with anyone else. And then the singles, you get married, you hang out with young marrieds.
Right.
And then it
Right.
would just get older. But it was like always like it was never this like interwoven community.
Right.
You
Right.
know what I mean? And if you wanted a friendship that was outside of that, you really had to actively seek it out. Um, so
And I think that that was specific. I don't think that that's necessarily specific to Atlanta, but I think that is very specific to the size of our church. Because
mhm.
from what I hear from people in smaller churches, that is much more integrated because they don't have enough people to have separate services and all these separate things,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
It really did us a big disservice because I think had our parents, for example, known really what we were being told in the teens and like and campus, they would have been like, oh no. Although, I mean, our parents were, I can't speak for your parents. I keep saying our parents. They were culpable in their own ways as well, and they were participatory in the system too, right?
yeah, my parents really loved the church. They
Yeah,
were
me too.
really sold sold out. Another word. They
So,
were they were very sold out for this. Um, and they kind of they put a lot of trust
yeah,
in this system. Um, yeah, I mean, they would just let me. I mean, when I was in the teen stuff, I would go with the teens. The teen workers, when that the teen worker came and met with me and said I wasn't being serious enough, I'm not allowed to go to these other teen events anymore. My parents just were like, okay, well, this is who you are now. And there
right,
was no real like follow up to what was going on. It was just,
right.
this is what they said. So we'll agree with it. And it's hard. It's hard to reconcile that sometimes, because there was a lot that I feel like, yeah, I don't know if my parents would have really heard everything if they would have been so trustworthy or
Yeah.
been so trusting of these people. Um, Yeah. I do want to go back to that whole like the dynamics between male and female in church because it's really not that kind of thing as I've been out of it and been to I mean I've been to dozens of other churches for work and then just my own research. It's there everywhere to
Yeah.
all these churches. Like there's I was I was watching this Instagram reel where this guy this these there were these two pastors and they were like, yeah, my wife should not have male friends and I can't have friends that are girls. It's just there's nothing they said there's nothing biblical about it. It only is going to lead to sin.
Well, that's what Mike Pence said, right? When he was
Yeah.
president, when
Mhm.
he was vice president, he said he never would have dinner alone with another woman or never be alone with
Yeah.
another like that. Yeah.
And it's just it just puts so much in your head and so much fear that doesn't need to be there, you
Yeah.
know.
Well, and like so I got married young. I got married when I was 21 in the church.
Uh,
And
yeah.
the young marrieds ministry was fucking wild. Like, like, like we were the worst message that I ever got from the young marrieds was we were in some kind of like young marrieds Bible talk in Athens, and they split us up, guys and girls. And the woman, who I'm sure, and who has been alone a very long time, um, she told us, she said straight up, like, you need to have sex with your husband every time he wants it, or he will cheat on you, or you will cause him to lust after other women and he will cheat on you, and it will be your fault. I have sex with my husband 5 times a week. And so afterwards, I'm like checking in with like Shauna and like other people be like, do you guys, do you, did you do that? Do you do that? Like every time they're like, no, my husband's 23. Like they can't, like, there's no way. Um, but that was the message that they were giving us about like,
Mhm.
and you internalize that, right?
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
it's not good.
Yeah. Um, that fear, if you don't do it this way, if you don't serve your man like you're supposed to, or for us, if you don't make your woman feel like, whatever,
Right.
then you're both gonna, disaster is gonna strike.
Yeah. And I think at like a deeper level, what that kind of fear-based system did to me was that it didn't, it's really interesting because for all of its focus on morality, it didn't really give me a rooted sense of morality because
Mhm.
everything I did was to avoid getting in trouble.
Yeah.
And so when I left the church, I really didn't have a sense of like, this is why people go wild when they leave the church because you don't have this like understanding, like, oh, some things that I do are harmful to me and that's not good. And some things that I do are harmful to others and that's not good because it doesn't matter because you're not going to get in trouble because you've left it all.
It's interesting that you say that it didn't give you a sense of morality because there's so many people that would say, no, this way gives you morality. This way
Right.
teaches you morality. But all it teaches you is to not get in trouble,
Yep.
like you were saying. It's crazy how it doesn't work. I mean, when I left, it was the same way. There was the wild times, there were things I had to learn what was right for me and what was wrong for me and all of that stuff. But there's no real conversations about anything. There's no integration of whatever we're feeling or discovering within ourselves. It all has to be through this lens of what was told to us by the leaders,
Yeah.
you know, and that's how we live life.
Yeah. And I think that most, if not every person that I know that was born into the church, at least, like became very good at compartmentalizing and very good at
Mhm.
lying
Yep.
because you just gotta, you know what you're expected to do. And it's just easier to just say it and not have to deal with it.
Hmm. Yeah, there was a lot of times I was like, I'm just not going to say this because I know that it's going to lead to this kind of conversation. I've been discipled so many times about other things. I just don't have the headspace right now, so I'm just going to be like, all right, yep, sure. I'm
Yep.
fine,
Huh?
you know.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. We got deep real fast. I love when this stuff happens. So let's go back a little bit.
Okay.
to the beginning. Um, what would you, when I say God, what did you view God as a kid?
I don't really know. I've been okay, so I I like to be prepared for things because it's helpful for
Mhm.
my anxiety. And so
Yep.
like I was like, oh, Roy's gonna ask me this question. I know he's gonna ask it's in his list. And I didn't get an answer ready because I really don't have a memory of like of conceptualizing God. I think that I guess somewhere in my head I had the old man in the sky kind of.
Well, here, let me try this. Like a feeling. Like if I were to say, if a feeling that comes up when I say God, is
Well,
it
here's
good,
the
bad? What
thing.
is it?
Here's my thing is that I my gut is that I stopped believing in God decades before I left the church.
Mm,
And so I think that because I was always very skeptical and I always had a really hard time believing in God in this
mhm.
sense. But I knew that in order to not in order to make my parents happy and in order to have
Yeah,
any friends at all, because that was the only way that you could have friends with people at church,
yeah.
that I would need to do certain things. So I I don't because I don't really have a memory of like a feeling of God of no, I remember trying to be like, okay, maybe I can make this work. Maybe I can like talk myself into, but maybe if I read enough Doug Jacoby books, I can make myself believe in God.
Read enough Doug Jacoby books.
You know, all the apologetics.
I mean, I knew the first time I knew I was going to hell and that God was disappointed in me. Like I have that memory in my
You
head.
do. When was that?
I was 13. It was the first time I masturbated.
Mm.
Yep. And I was like, oh, okay. So this is the dividing line. I've
Is
done
it?
this now. So because I've done this, I was mad. I was like, thanks a lot, because it was after a sex ed class. When you first learn that you can do these things, it's very embarrassing,
You're like,
but
might
not
as well
really.
smoke crack now and go murder someone.
I know. Because you always talk, because we talked about like when are you a kid and you're like innocent, and when
Hmm.
are you not innocent anymore? And so I remember after doing it, this immense amount of like shame and guilt that just piled onto me. And I was like, oh, so this is what they're talking about. This is why Jesus died. I killed a man, like all of those things. Like I'm gonna go to hell. If I were to die in a car crash, I'm gonna go to hell now. So that
Yeah.
was kind of like a view of God. And so, but anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, and it's so hard because it was like, I should go back and read my journals.
Hmm.
They're at my dad's house. I should read back and read my quiet time journals because I know that it was a struggle, or maybe it's like just repressed. Like, I haven't had proper therapy to deal with this because I was dealing with
Hmm.
a lot of issues in my life that were not fundamental, but I need to deal with this. Because there was a time where I was like in it for real. I was in it and I was really good at
Hmm.
it too. Like,
Yeah.
but I can't access it. I don't know.
Yeah, I have a lot of visceral memories of, like, you mentioned journaling and this popped up. Um, I used to write whenever I would write the letter I, like if I was referring to myself as I, like I want to do this, I would do lowercase I, not uppercase I.
Okay, so in your opinion, when you did that, was that performative or was it real or both?
Um, I think it was half and half. I felt like, because you always had this sense that someone was watching, right? Or something or someone was watching what you're doing.
It's like Foucault. It's the internalization of power. Like,
Mhm. And so I felt like God needed to be more important than myself. And how can I show him while I'm journaling? Well, I'm going to do lowercase I for myself, and that's going to show how humble I am. And so there was a feeling of wanting to perform, but also this, like, I mean, you hear this in a lot of churches that like God has to be so big
Right.
that you're small.
Yeah.
Um, and not small in like you think about like I know that comparatively of the world, we're very small because we're a part of this giant world that's a part of this giant solar system. Like that's a different small
Right.
than what I'm thinking of, you know. Mine
Right.
is like confidence and like place and things like that. It just is like,
You always had to earn it.
yeah, yeah,
Which is, sorry.
it's
You're good.
okay.
Which is interesting if you think about this. Like they always talked about. Do you remember the airplane analogy? The
You had
works,
to have your
works and
faith and
deeds.
doctrine, faith and works, right? Hmm.
Hmm. Faith and works. Yeah.
Oh, oh my God, that stresses me out to think about that. Oh my gosh.
Um, but you couldn't play the plane without both. And it's so interesting how it's like, after all of that emphasis on that, then it really actually was works. Like it was like what you could show that you were doing, right?
Yeah. And they, you would hear things like, yeah, your faith is great, but really what matters is your works, you know?
I think that I think my turning point with the church was before I got baptized, actually. So I was baptized in ninth grade, and then I left when I was like 24 or something like that. But I remember in seventh grade, Mother Teresa died when I was in seventh grade. And there was this big conversation about like whether Mother Teresa was going to go to heaven or not. And the consensus was no, she was not.
Wow.
And I think that my bullshit radar went off pretty strongly at that
Hmm.
point because I was like, I don't know if that's right. Like that doesn't sound accurate to me. She was like living in the slums. She dedicated her life to helping people. If there's a heaven,
Yeah.
then she's probably going. Um, but I think that both within the church and within my family structure, it was just easier to just go with what they wanted and
Hmm.
just not make a fuss unless it was really important.
Yeah. I think the problem right there is the fact that you're having a conversation whether some Mother Teresa's going to heaven or not. I mean, right there, the whole conversation is just, come on, really?
I mean, I think they
This is
talked about that like at my light and darkness study or one of the studies. Like I think it came
oh,
up.
oh, geez. Yeah. They used to have there was before I left the church that I was with, this was the church before, it wasn't my last church, it was the church before when I was working with the teens. There was this big intern project that they would be doing where they have people in campus come from all over
Mhm.
uh America to come like work as interns at our church to kind of like build a new campus, campus leaders and stuff like
It was like
that.
we were kind of a youth core site.
Yeah, totally, 100%. Um, and one of the things that they did was they would have one of their sessions was debating, and they would be debating things like this, and it was like to train you for stuff like that. Because I remember one of the debates questions I remember hearing about was like, let's say you have an estranged mother that you haven't seen for, I don't know, 10 years. And she shows up in your life saying, hey, can we have a cup of coffee? I want to reconnect. I want to talk. There's a lot I need to tell you, stuff like that. But it's on a Wednesday night. What do you do?
That's so fucked up, Roy. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Well, and I think like that obviously like is a very extreme example.
Hmm.
But like I think that something that I kind of always feel is like people talking about like the letter as this pivotal point or like
Hmm.
that it got really weird in the 90s and that like it got really cultish in the 90s or after that. But like my parents' relationship with both of their parents was very, very bad because of the church, stemming from when they joined the church in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
They weren't allowed to get married in Ohio, where all of my grandparents were, because they weren't allowed to go home on for weekends. They weren't allowed to go home for holidays. And so the seeds of that have always been there. And I think the structures developed in a way that was toxic, but like that like it for us or against us has always been in the DNA of this place.
Yeah, I didn't know about those things until after my dad passed.
Yeah.
After when my dad passed, and there were some issues with where the funeral was going to be, where the service, because a lot of people didn't want to be there was some people that didn't want it to be at the church.
Yeah.
And then as I've like talked with a couple of my family members, there was definitely this sense of concern they always had for what my parents were in.
Yeah. Same.
Um, which was it wasn't surprising, but it was also hard here because it was always this struggle. We had to get to Sunday service.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like my parents tried their best, and I mean, we saw our relatives a good bit, but we would always just leave either Saturday or early Sunday morning so that we could find a church on the way home to go
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was tough. We were very tribal,
Yes.
and it cut us off from a lot of the world, a lot of people. So,
Well, and I think that like, I mean, that's like very, like all that is very dark and it's very upsetting part of the church. But I think on the
mhm,
plus side, it's like when my mom died, like everyone was bringing us food. There was so
mhm,
much support. She was taking care of her whole way through chemo. Like, she had people. There were so many people that she was in because it was this like very intact community.
mhm,
And like, you know, I know that if I ever get sick, I'm not going to have a community like that. I think
mhm,
you guys have talked about this. You've talked about this before. It's like, that's very compelling to have that built-in network where, that people will take care of you if you're sick and that people will be there to watch your kids. Um, and I think like, you know, it filled a gap for a lot of people in, especially in the 80s and 90s where everyone was so mobile, where you had this economic, one of my majors is in sociology. So just like humor me out for a second. So you have this like
mhm,
greater societal patterns of movement and economic migration. And so people are distance wise separated from their extended families. They don't have these networks. People are lonely and they're looking for more networks. And the church fills in, but their extended families are still there, but they're not as proximal anymore.
mhm,
So you have this kind of, it's this vacuum that the church fills, and then they seal you off.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed that the friends of mine in my life became way closer than any relative
Yeah.
that I had. Not that there's not love for my family. It's just we just never, we saw them when we could, and there was a good bit of time, but like we were with the church so much.
Right.
And so you develop these deep, meaningful relationships with people and this network, like you're saying, and kind of like it is kind of like your family, but that's how they get you, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what were the positives about this? Like in the beginning, like as a kid or like stuff, you know?
Um, I loved how much time we got to spend with our friends
Yeah. Hmm.
because, you know, when we were little, it was like 2 or 3 times a week, every week,
Hmm.
you'd see your friends and you get to hang out with them and you're just like, this is great. Because, you don't really have that and like built in like this time. And then the other thing that was good for me is that we talked about this a little bit before we were recording is that we lived in a neighborhood starting when I was in middle school and through high school where a bunch of other people in the church had purposefully moved. So um, I think there were something like 9 families from the church in my neighborhood. And so,
Lucky.
yeah. And so, and since those were the only people we were allowed to hang out with, like we had these friends that it was so easy to just walk over to their house. Like our next door neighbors were in the church, like, you know, um, and so that was really, really cool. And that was like really special. I think
Hmm.
that it created a kind of, it almost feels like golden or like magical in my mind because it was like just this time where we were just, you know, together. And I think the other thing is that that kind of coincided with like the lack of a lot of adult supervision in the 90s. And so we're all right, go to the pool, you'll be there for 4 hours, come home whenever. Um, that was an interesting, I don't know if you've thought about this a lot, but it was this interesting mix of being very, very over supervised and unsupervised, somehow existing together. Um,
Hmm.
and I don't know if that was your experience, but like there was a lot of control over like who I spent time with and like what I wore and like things like that. But like for the most part, like what was going on within those structures, my parents had no idea. Um, like
Yeah.
so yeah,
There was definitely control with who you could go, who you could be around, what you were doing, stuff like that. But as long as you were in this umbrella of that, like you were in those parameters, um, then nobody cared. I
yeah.
can remember like, when you would go to these teen devos after church, my parents would just leave church and I would just be
Yeah.
to my own devices. And there were times when like I didn't hang out with anybody and I would just be wandering around a mall by myself for like 3 hours until just killing time until the Devo started, because I might not have been like fast enough to get into a car with some people or just whatever it was.
I loved, so this is, I guess, the thing for me is like, I think I was always a little bit skeptical of the doctrine and I never wanted to have visitors to church. Um, but I loved like teen devos. I loved like being a part of something
Hmm.
because you just like you knew that okay, after church, you have to leave by 12:30 because then we've got to go to Gwinnett Place Mall and we've got to get lunch. And then we've got to get over to East Cobb by 2 for Devo. And it's just like you're just hanging out all the time.
Hmm.
And that's like that was great. I loved it. It was awesome.
Yeah, I didn't I didn't have close enough friends then to where that was kind of like a cool thing. Like I can remember like you'd say Teen Devo, I think pressure immediately.
Mm.
It's weird. But you did like there was this sense of like I just think about like I could have gone and done anything and my parents would have not known.
Never, never. Mm-mm. Yep.
Yeah. There's just this level of trust and okay, no, we know they're doing this, so that's what they're going to be doing and they're going to be okay.
Yeah. I think for me, like, like I, I wasn't, I'm not cool. Like
Hmm.
school was not, like, school was very easy for me, but like making friends at school was not something that came easily for me. But people
Hmm.
kind of had to be your friend in the church if you were a disciple, right? Like if
Yeah.
you were
Hmm.
in it, then you had to like have friends and it gave you this structure where like you would spend enough time with people and then eventually they're like, okay, I know you, or I've known you since I was 3. And so,
Hmm.
um, so I think that for me, it felt like safe because I didn't really know how to make friends with people otherwise. And, but I knew I had my church friends and like, that was cool. And I think that leaving the church has been very difficult to learn how to make friends, but,
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
I think that that was great. I mean, obviously camp, like,
Yeah.
everyone talks about camp. I like we were full, you and I were full time together, like
Hmm.
um at camp for a few summers. Camp was great. I loved camp. So starting when I was oh, like probably my second year, so I was like 10. my parents, their agreement was like, they would pay for 1 week of camp for me, but any
Yep.
other weeks that I wanted to go, I had to pay for. So I would like save my babysitting money all year to pay for extra weeks of camp because I loved it. Like, it just was
Yeah.
like, it was great.
It was the only bright spot for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was a
I
bright
still
spot for
have my,
everybody.
I still have my Woodmont 93 shirt.
What? Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
Mhm.
Ah,
Do you
that's
remember the
so
camp
cool.
movies that Joel used to make?
Yep, those camp movies. Uh-huh. I they're so 90s. Just the way that they're like cut. I remember seeing one and like all the music that was in it. Like I remember there's a Seal song and
Yep.
just
Yep.
like
That was in the 95 one. I think it was at Camp Lee. Yep.
uh-huh. Gosh. I try to bring up camp a lot with people that I knew had gone just because I feel like I just want to like that I feel like was the place where like I always felt safe.
Yeah.
And I want to continue talking about camp and making sure that, with all this other stuff that we're talking about, like I want to put out there that camp was of all the things that like we deal with or go to therapy for, like camp was that bright spot. Camp was positive, camp was safe. Camp was a place where like I felt seen and heard
Yeah.
through all this craziness.
Um, do you remember when they used to do Best Camper?
Yep, I remember best camper, still hates it. That's the only
Every year, my best friend Danielle and I would have these like vicious competitions about like who would win Best Camper. And like it
uh-huh.
was her, me. Usually, like because we were fucking awesome. It would
Yeah.
always be one of us. But I'm like, why did you I think that was a good idea to give an award to the kid who's the most like Jesus? Like, what?
Well, I mean, that's just such a like that's such a like a camp thing, you
Hmm.
know. Not even like our camp, but you would
Right.
always have something like that.
But the first time I ever saw my mom cry was when I won Best Camper. And I mean, and I think that like shows like that signal to me, like, okay, this is really important to her. You
Yeah.
have to do
Mhm.
these good things. Hmm.
Yeah, that definitely you felt that as a kid. Like I remember like seeing my dad cry at my baptism and knowing, okay, this was the right thing to do, stuff like that. The only thing I ever really won at camp once week we got cleanest cabin award.
I remember like when we were both full time together, you would a lot of times you would have the little boys and it would be like the running joke about how dirty your cabins were.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I always got the youngest boys. Um, which is, I mean, it's just my thing. I mean, I did teach elementary school for 10 years, so
Right.
it was like, um, I used to get, I kind of liked it, um, because counseling older boys or middle school boys was always tough, but,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I always feel like Peter Pan, it's just
Yeah,
like
no, that was
these
your
little
vibe.
lost boys running around.
My best one of my best camp stories was um in my first year was at Camp Woodmont in 93 and
Mhm.
um we were choosing a song for lip sync and we ended up doing Free Your Mind.
Oh, wow.
Um no, that's not true. We did Free Your Mind and then we got to like Wednesday and then our counselors sat us down and apparently they had gotten rebuked for picking Free Your Mind because they say the word prostitute in it and they're like this is not
Oh,
appropriate
yeah.
for
Hmm.
9 and 10-year-old girls to be dancing to. Valid. um so we had to change to everybody dance now. And so I cannot dance. I never had any dancing skills. So instead of making me and that like the whole line with the girls and their thing, I was the singer that so that was my role. And so they're like, okay, Liz, you're just gonna like kind of sway. You're gonna stand on a table, you're gonna have a microphone, you're gonna sway, and you're gonna like that's gonna be you. And so they like put me, they've never gotten away with this when we were counselors, but they put me in a bathing suit. They stuffed the top of my bathing suit with like,
Huh?
and my butt too. So I had big boobs, big butt. bathing suit, big hair. And Sonny to this day will be like, he's like, you walked out. And I was like, oh, Joe is going to kill me if he finds out that Liz is in it. Like, my dad. He's like, I cannot believe that I have Joe's daughter with a stuffed bathing suit dancing on a table.
Oh, those lip syncs. I dressed so many boys up like girls.
Yep.
Oh, that was a problem. Oh man. It's just so funny you think about camp in the 90s versus nowadays
Yeah.
and this lawlessness. Lip syncs, yeah. Those lip syncs were always I always ended up getting my cabins would always get like most original, which just meant weird, you
Yeah.
know? Um, but it was just so much fun. It was just this break of all the pressure,
Yeah. Right.
you
Mhm.
know? We could just exist and that would be okay, you
Yep.
know? Who
Yeah.
we are was okay. What we were doing was okay. And I mean, for me, this kid who was trying to find himself for so long. I mean, I remember one year at camp rolling up in Jinkos, you know, and just like a ball chain necklace and stuff. And you're
Mhm.
just like, I don't know what I'm doing, but it was fine there, you
Yeah.
know?
I still have dreams sometimes that I'm like, we're camp, like the property of the swamp is like in my dream. Like I'm on the property at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a special place. I got married there.
You got married at camp?
Yep.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. It's very cool.
Did Sonny
Oh, of course
oversee
he
it?
did. You know, he fucking officiated. Yeah.
Oh, you lucky. Oh, you
I know. We
I
had got it right after they did Bash, like Teen Bash. So like we
mhm.
didn't have to pay an extra facilities fee because all the stuff was already turned on. We were just kind of like glomming onto that. So we got married January 1st, 2006. hmm
Wow, that's cool.
And now it's weird because that was my ex-husband, my now ex-husband. We're still close. It's fine. But uh one thing that is really interesting and strange when I talk to my wife and my friends now is like how many weddings we went to growing up and
Mhm,
in the teens. And like when I tell people, like, it's like, yeah, I had 300 people at my wedding. And like we sent invitations, but like probably most of those people were just heard about it in an announcement at church. And they're like, what? Like, how did you do that? I'm like, "Mm, we
mhm.
just, mhm,
Yeah, my first date in campus was to a wedding. There were so many weddings that you went to. Oh
mhm."
God. And they were never fun. I never had fun at those weddings.
Yeah. Well, you didn't go to my wedding. You would have had fun at my wedding. You might
Yeah,
have
there
gone
was
to my
never
wedding. There's a chance
do
you went
what?
to my wedding. I said we had fun at my wedding. But right, if you went on a date with someone who you didn't know and like, yeah. hmm
Gosh, those weddings. Oh man. So let's see. So when did things start getting weird? I
So
th-
so like I've said, I think the roots were there for a long time, but
mm,
so I got baptized when I was in my freshman year of high school, and
mhm,
there was this class of girls who was 2 years older than me who were like really kind of holding the teens together. And then they all graduated. And one of those teens had been my discipler. And she was like, honestly, just great. Like, never, she wasn't pushy. She wasn't like, there was nothing, like, it was all kind of copacetic. I would get discipled for some stuff by teen workers other times, but never by her. We just had a really good relationship. And then she graduated and I got a teen worker who was not so flexible and not so like, I don't know. And it just really started to turn
mhm,
after everyone left. So this was like my junior year of high school. So like one example of this is I was um I was leading this, I was like helping lead studies of this girl who was another Kingdom kid. She was a few years younger than me. Maybe she was 1 year younger than me. And she was like very dorky, would always wear big shirts, pants, long hair, whatever. And they were like, Liz, you need to design a study for her about how she needs to like look sharper. Like, and I was like, I don't know how to do that. That's not a thing. And they're like, no, no, no. You like, we believe that you can do it. You need to like research scriptures, on like how she needs to present herself better and like, you know, tell this girl that she needs to do a better job of like looking better at church. And I fucking did it. And I'm not proud of it. Like, that's like not something that, yeah, but like I was like 16. And so, so then like like, I did this study and she like got her hair cut and started straightening it and started wearing better clothes and they let her get baptized. But it was just like, that made me so cynical. Like, I was like, this doesn't feel good. Um, Another instance of that in the teens was I was discipling this girl who was a few years younger than me, who was on the soccer team, and they had some kind of tournament. And she was like, Liz, the conflict about missing midweek. And I was like, she was like, I have to miss Bible talk one day for a thing. Do you think it's okay? I was like, well, if you made a commitment to your team, so like if you need to miss Bible talk, if you feel okay about that, then I think it's okay. Like, it's for visitors anyway. Like, you being on the team shows that you're committed to something, and that's like you showing up for them, and like you're not going to be a good example to them by flaking out. But if you don't want to, then don't do it. And so she got other advice, and that was not the good advice that I gave her, obviously. And my discipler then called me in and rebuked me for giving her bad advice. And I was like, I stand by it. Like, I don't like, like it's one service, one time. And then they brought the big guns in, they brought the team leader in. And I was like, okay, like, I don't know what you want from me. So that kind of stuff
Jeez.
kind of started piling up. And then when I was a freshman, but then I stayed because like it was my whole world. Like,
Yeah.
and I just had this thought like, okay, I can get to Athens because I wanted to go to Athens to go to school and like everything will be okay. And um, so I went up to Athens, and then my freshman year, I was paired with one of my dearest friends, who was in the church at the time, but she left. She was like on the outs our first semester freshman year. And then she left, and my discipler left my first semester freshman year. And then the letter came out January '03. So it was my second semester in college. And we were just
Wow.
really optimistic at the time. We were thinking like
Hmm.
everything's going to change. This is going to be it. Um,
Yeah.
so I was like a little bit unsupervised because like I didn't have a discipler because she had fallen away and my roommate had fallen away. So I was in this kind of space where I was like, okay, well, whatever. Um, so then I made it a few years in campus, and then my breaking point with the church was in 2005. Now, mind you, I didn't leave until 2008, 2009. But in 2005, I knew that I needed to leave. And I was sure that I didn't believe in anything that they were doing. I felt like it was so legalistic and so um, dictatorial and all this stuff. And even though they had
Hmm.
said that they were going to do all these changes, that everything was still the same. Um, but I knew that I was dating my then boyfriend, then became my husband. I was dating Cedric at the time. And I knew that if I left, that we would have to break up. And so I remember he was like delivering pizzas for Papa John or something. He came over after his shift and we like cried in the parking lot at like 3 a.m. I was like, I can't like I don't know what to do. Like I don't believe this stuff. Like they are crazy. This is crazy shit. But I love you and I don't want to break up with you. And he had a very different perspective on the church because he had been met in college and he was like, yeah, they're crazy, but like they're good people. Their hearts are in the right place. And like just take what you want and leave what you don't. And I was like, well, you're not doing it right. That's not how we do it here.
What? No, you can't do that in our church.
Um, so I knew I needed to leave, but I stayed. I stayed for him. And so we got married about 6 months later. And then we were in Athens for a year as young marrieds. And then we moved up to New York. And the New York church got hit very, very hard by the letter, like in terms of
Yeah.
their numbers. And so when we got up there, it was like a group of maybe like 150 people and very, very scattered. And so So we made friends, but we got up there and immediately they were like, you guys are going to be Bible talk leaders. You guys are going to be the Columbia Bible talk leaders. And we want you just to like start thinking about at the Bible talk leaders meeting, the first and only one I ever went to. They were like, we're just going to like, we're not going to tell people that we're doing discipleship partners, but we're going to do discipleship partners. So just like kind of pick someone and then just like make it happen. And I was like, this feels really
Jeez.
shady. I'm not going to do that. And uh, so we didn't do that. And then, so it was just like this series of kind of like unraveling over many years. But then the final straw was, we were studying the Bible with this girl who I didn't meet, but um, who was coming, and she was like, you know, she was on top of it. She had been baptized as an adult a few years before in another like evangelical church, and had been having her quiet time for years, was like genuinely a good person. And we get to a certain point in the studies, she was like, great, I want to join your church. I don't feel like I need to get rebaptized because my baptism was valid. It was like, you know, I'm not doing this again. And we reached a standstill, and the leader of the church said that she couldn't come anymore because she wouldn't get rebaptized. And I was like, who the fuck are you to like decide whether her baptism is valid or not?
Yeah. Jeez.
So that was what did it for me. And then um and then I just stopped coming. Um and Cedric went for 1 or 2 weeks without me, and it was like too much intensity with him about where I was. And so he stopped coming, and we had been pretty close with some couples and some people in New York, and they messaged me when I left, and I wrote them a long message saying like I would love to talk to you about that, and never heard from them again. So,
Hmm.
yep, that was the that was why I left. And then yeah, I really never looked back. It was never something that like felt difficult, but after I when I like years later, I was talking to Lauren, my roommate, who's then her husband now, Taylor. I was asking him like what he thought when I left the church. He was like, I wasn't surprised. You were doing children's ministry so that you didn't have to go to services. And he did said that. And I realized that like since campus, I had been volunteering as for children's ministry every week so that I didn't have to sit in services.
I
And
did
that
the
actually
same
really worked.
thing.
Yeah, because then you get like everyone thinks you're such a servant and you're so good and you can just go hang
Yeah.
out with the kids.
I did that. I did that for a solid 2 years in campus
Yep.
so that I didn't have to meet with everybody.
Yeah.
It was just a really good way to hide. I mean, I do. That's my passion is working with kids and
That's some,
mentoring and all that stuff. But I mean, I just didn't have to be in all that. It
yeah.
just made it easier.
Yep.
Yeah. You mentioned this thing about you put it like you were chasing you we put up with a lot of stuff because we were chasing this thing. At least that's how I felt.
Yeah.
This was my world, but for me, I felt like, yeah, I'll finally get it right somehow, and then it'll all be worth it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we stayed in a bit longer than we probably should have, because I mean, there was this sense of, I don't know, yeah, it was your whole world, but also for me, it was like, I mean, what's the alternative? I mean, I guess I'll figure it out. I'll get it right.
I mean, I have so much respect to everyone who has been able to leave the church that they in the city that they were from,
Mhm.
um, as well as to people like who were raised in it and were always like, that's never for me. And one of my brothers
Mhm.
was like that, like, nope, not for me. Because I if I hadn't moved to New York, if I hadn't been dislocated, I don't think I would have been able to do it because
Mhm.
my entire world was structured around this church. Like I don't have I feel I feel like I missed out on on a lot in high school and college because I don't have any friends that weren't in the church. And so, you know, it was a loss. And,
Hmm.
and there's nothing I can do about it now, but you know, it was it doesn't feel great.
Yeah, I know. I think it was easier for me because I moved out of a state. I
Right.
moved states away.
Yeah.
Um, like when I was leaving, I had one foot in, one foot out.
Yep.
I had friends that weren't a part of the church, but I also had friends that were still a part of it. They were like, some of them would be like trying to tell me about certain girls to date that were still in the church because there was this, no, it'll be okay. You could do, stuff like that. And they were cool, but I know that if I would have stayed in Georgia, I probably would have stayed in the church
Right.
longer because
Yeah.
yeah, it was easy. Hmm. So what was it like after you left?
So, that's the story. So my 20s got really interesting after I left. So I left the
Uh-huh.
church and my parents were like disappointed but understanding. Um and so but within like a year and a half, I realized that like I was probably gay, which was something. So it's interesting because my coming out was so close to me leaving the church that a lot of people think that it was related, but I had no idea that I was gay before I left the church.
Really?
None, not a single, never. But it's funny because Cedric used to joke when we were dating, he would be like, "Oh, it's a good thing you didn't go to Agnes Scott or you'd be a lesbian." And I'd be like, "Ah, that's so funny. That's such a funny joke." Um, uh, Jackie, our mutual friend, used to call me Lesbo, like Lisbo, Lisbo. Um,
Oh, wow. Was it, I
oh,
mean, what was it, just like your personality, or did you
I
drive a
think that
Subaru? I'm sorry.
I did.
I'm sorry.
I don't know. When I came out to my mom, she was like, "I know," and I was like, "What?" Um, I don't know. I think it's just a vibe. But I think that because our sexuality was so on lockdown, it was so divorced from dating and so divorced from like romance and all this stuff. And I know for y'all, you guys talked about masturbation and impurity all the time, but they didn't talk about it that explicitly with us, with me at least. It was like this kind of vague like impurity, and it had to do with like the shirts you were wearing and like, but
The church.
I I didn't really connect it. And so I think that
Yeah.
I remember in middle school, everyone was like very obsessed with like Jonathan Taylor Thomas.
Mhm.
I was like, I really don't understand like what, like, I I just didn't get it. But I had like a poster of Natalie Portman on my bedroom wall, and I was just like, look at her. Like, so
Oh,
like,
yeah.
um, so I think that like, had I been a place that I could be more exploratory or that was the possibility, then I would have realized it early on.
Hmm.
Um, but it just was never even an option. It didn't even cross my mind.
There was no language for that.
Hmm. Yeah.
There was no like conversations. I think it was, though, for guys it might be different because when you get into like a very separate, high intensity like group setting, like just a bunch of men,
Yeah.
it gets incredibly homoerotic really fast.
Yeah.
And
Well,
just
and I will say that like like we did homoerotic shit too. The girls did. Like, okay, so we used
mhm,
to play this game. Um, if any of you girls in the East are listening, and you'll know which game I'm talking about, where it's called Freeze Out, where
uh-huh,
we were driving in a car and we would take off our shirts while driving down the highway, and
uh,
whoever could keep their shirt off the longest without getting too cold would win.
oh geez.
That's that's homoerotic.
We had shower club.
Shower club.
Shower club was the one time when I was shamed for not thinking something was cool. And I remember being like, I can live with this. Um, Basically you would oh man, this is I'm gonna put it out there. Fuck it. I don't care. So you would undress and go to the showers
Hmm.
at camp in the cabins, in your cabin, and you would walk all the way nude into camp to the shower, and then you would just hang out nude and just be like this, like it was like very like just it just always felt weird. It got ixnayed really fast once
Oh,
they
I
heard
bet.
people were doing that. That's another thing about camp that I always respected was if something happened, it was dealt with like really quickly.
Ah,
Um, but it was like this thing, and they would just be like they would shower with like the stalls open. And you just be sitting there and and then some I remember one time somebody there was like two in the shower and it's like, nah, it's just shower club. That's what this is. And I was like, guys, this is weird. I don't feel like and they like made fun of me. It was pretty funny,
funny.
but yeah.
Random camp memory that I just remembered that has nothing to do with this. Do you remember when Jim microwaved the chicken and thought it cooked it and ate it raw? I think it was
Yeah.
Jim and Kevin, and they were like throwing up for hours.
Um, oh, freeze out. Oh my gosh.
Um,
Jeez,
yeah,
that's
so I think
hilarious.
that to that, so I think that I just didn't feel like I had any room for anything outside of what there was expected of me. And
Mhm.
that included an exploration of who I was, my sexuality. And I think that that's really different than the guys you've had on your podcast that have been gay, because I think that guys usually can identify really, really young that they're gay, just
Mhm.
because I think that sexuality manifests itself really different in men. And for most women, there's not necessarily that immediate identification. For some, there certainly is, but that's not a universal experience. And so I am really grateful that I didn't feel tortured, or I mean, I can't imagine what
Mhm.
that experience would have been like. That would have been terrible for me, but I didn't have that experience. It just was like, okay, well, I guess I'm gay. So,
Yeah.
but in terms of like, so then I realized I was gay, and then Cedric and I got divorced, and then I started dating my wife. And then when I came out to my dad, or I came out to my mom, and she said, I know, don't tell your dad, let me tell him. And so I was like, okay, fine. So then my dad
Yeah.
called me a few days later, and he started like reading scriptures to me. And I stopped him. I said, Dad, this is the only conversation that we will ever have arguing about my sexuality, because I know what you're going to say, and I know that you believe it, but I have different beliefs than you. And this is not going to be a productive conversation. So I will hear you out this one time and never again. And to his infinite credit, he like respected that, and he gave me his peace and has never said it since. And since, and then my mom got sick about 6 months later, and then she died of cancer a year later. And then he got remarried a few years after that. And I think that his new wife, who's also from the church, she was in Boston, so that's like a whole different level of
Mhm.
churchiness. But she has pulled him so far to the left. She has been very, very inclusive of me and my wife, and has really changed, has helped him be supportive of me in a way that is unimaginable from where he was when I first came out. So that's been really a gift. So that's how it's been since I left, you know. I
Mhm.
think the hardest thing was, and I don't know how, I think you've talked about this a little bit, was when my mom died. I had to be so in the church world again. And I had been out of it at that point for 4 years or so. And it was like so much to absorb all of their language, um, when I really didn't want to, you know.
In what way? What do you mean?
Well, just like this, like, you know, your mom's looking at you from heaven, like
Oh yeah. Mhm.
like she's in a better place. And
He's where he's always wanted to be.
that, I was like, bullshit. She didn't want to die. Like,
This was God's plan.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
There's a bigger purpose in all of this.
Yep.
Um, just made me like furious a lot of
Angry.
times.
So angry. Mm-hmm.
Hmm. It's really hard to, and they're trying to make sense of death,
Right.
and they're hurting. And that was when I realized that, like, he was my dad, but he was also someone's friend,
Right.
someone's mentor. He was someone's brother. So there was this like multi, maybe multifaceted. I don't know if that's the word, but just he was just it was just different things. He was more than that. And so I was just watching how people were dealing with his death. And the language it was challenging just as much. Because you know, I think the hardest part is like that's God's plan.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
the hardest one to deal with.
Yeah. I didn't like that. Well, and the other thing that I did that I didn't realize that I was doing till much later was that, and I think this is the church thing too, is like I felt like I had to rank everyone and who had the right to be the most sad about my mom's death. So like I could
Mm,
rank the appropriate amount of grief that was okay. So it's like, and I wasn't at the top of that list because like, you know, there were other people ahead of me, like my grandmother who had lost her son much earlier. I was like, oh, to lose two children, that's big. So, it's like her and then my granddad, and then like maybe my dad and my sister because she was younger than me and still living at home. And then like me and my brothers, maybe we were right here, or maybe my aunt. But
mhm,
like, and so, but it's so messed up. But it just, I think it reflects this like way we were raised in the church to like have your place and to know your
mhm,
place and to be at a certain point in this hierarchy.
mhm,
Um, that's very fixed. And I think that when I did that, then my mom's friends would come to me and be like, "Oh, I miss your mom so much." I would get so angry inside and be like, "You don't get to talk to me about my mom. Like, no, I miss her. You don't get to miss her. Like, you don't get to talk
yeah.
to me about that." Um,
I used to get frustrated because it was like, okay, let me help you through your grief.
right. Yep.
Like, okay, thanks. This is like it was this it was his celebration of life or whatever. And this woman was like, I just miss your dad so much and so much. She starts crying. And I was just like, great. Okay, it's
What do you
gonna
want me
be
to do
fine.
this? Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I'm supposed to comfort you now. Like everyone's supposed to be comforting me. Like screw you. Um, but you realize just how it's like it was like death was this communal thing, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was interesting too because like I had this conflicting emotions because where my parents landed with church was a very healthier place
Mm,
than what it was.
yeah.
So the church they were at, hold on. It was just a very it was probably the safest I felt. It was a really great place.
That's
And
great.
so I was really looking forward to celebrating my dad's life with these people. Well, then you have the other side of the family who didn't have the same experience, especially, even some of my brothers and things like that. Because my brothers weren't one of my brothers never became a disciple.
Right.
One became a disciple and fell away, all that stuff. But there was a pushback. And so it was just this very like conflicting thing. And so that was hard to deal with because I'm coming back to a place where it's like, I mean, yeah, I left the church. I don't really want to go to a church anymore or go here, but
Right.
it's not because of these people.
Right.
These people were loving and caring of supportive of me in a time that I needed it. And my parents were, such fixtures of the church, and the people at the church loved my parents and they wanted to celebrate. So there was this like, it just was weird. Um, but it was just, we all had hurt from the church and from the past.
Yeah.
And that
I
was,
think it's like we were all I think that where I land with the church is that like there are very few people in the church who I believe were like intentionally bad actors. Like very,
mhm,
very few. And so I think that a system arose that was reflective of everyone's flaws. And, I think that, and that was led by a narcissist, like a pathological, like Kip is, I think, a deeply dangerous person. And so, I think that, but outside of that, I think that, obviously, I think for the most part, people were just trying to do what they thought was right. And,
Yeah.
and I think that, like, you know, we all got caught up in something that, like, sometimes really sucked and sometimes really hurtful, but it was our experience. And so, you know, you just gotta keep going.
Well, I mean, yeah, we all got caught up in stuff, it was filled with a bunch of narcissists. That's a word that keeps coming up the more we do this. It just was a system that benefited narcissistic people.
Um,
And when narcissistic people get in power, they want to stay in power, and then they breed other people under them that are just as narcissistic. And there were good ideas and good thoughts got out of control.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, people like your parents and my parents were kind of in, I feel like they had a similar vibe where it's like
Yeah. Hmm.
they weren't they weren't really cool necessarily. They weren't included in leadership structures necessarily, but they were informal leadership in the
Hmm.
church in those ways. And they were kind of like, pillars of their churches because they just loved God and they loved people so much. And
Hmm.
I think that sometimes that blinded them to the flaws of the system and to what it was doing to their kids. But, like, you know, I think that, and I think that I don't know about, I think you talked about this for your parents, but I think it was, like, kind of hurtful to my parents that they could never figure out how they could be in the ministry. Because I think that they would have loved, I mean, my dad was in the ministry when we were little, but he just couldn't keep it up. Um, and so I think that, like, they just weren't sharp enough. And
Yeah.
their love
My
of the church was so deep. Yeah.
hmm my parents were just really into serving,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and loving people. Um, that I mean, they were Bible talk leaders
Right. Right.
for a long time. I don't think there's anyone that has known my parents that like could say a bad word about, kind of how they
Yeah.
were with each other. My dad was always giving to people. My dad also was so musical, so he was always in the worship.
Yeah.
So he was always leading worship and those kind of things. That was always my favorite part to see. So that was kind of my dad's place in the church,
Yeah.
really, when you think about it, was just the musical side of things. And he had such a gift for that. Just leading people and, taking a room of 200 or 300 people and making them sound like a choir.
Yeah.
Um, they really they just loved, they loved God. They loved people. Um, their house was always an open door.
Yeah.
So like, that's just that's something that I think is really cool. You can't fault someone for that. And they were always supportive of me even when I left.
Yeah.
I remember, I don't know if I've said this on the podcast before, but when I had to tell my dad I was moving in with my now wife, we were girlfriend, boyfriend at the time, and it feeling like you know,
Dirty.
yeah. And I was like ready for him to just be so angry and mad at me, and it was anything but that. And so, it's just that's kind of cool. So I don't know. I feel lucky in that sense because I know that a lot of people didn't have that.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think? So we were in a cult?
Um, yeah, we were in a cult. I think I told you before we got on, there's a specific word for this kind of church. It's high demand, high control church. So if
Yep.
anyone feels uncomfortable with the word cult, I used to have a friend in high school who would say, like, Oh, you guys gonna go sacrifice goats today? Like you sacrificed any goats this weekend? After the 2020 interview came out. So we're not that kind of cult. We were a high demand, high control religion. Yes.
Yeah. I like that. Cool. Well, thanks for coming on. Thanks for talking. Thanks for sharing.
All right. So good to thank you
Um,
for having me on, Roy. Thanks for doing this. This is good work you're doing.
cool. I appreciate that. And yeah, if any of you guys listen here, we're part of the ICOC and want to come on and share your story, positive, negative, whatever. Let's talk. I want to hear it. You can reach out to me at Clemens with a Z at gmail.com or direct message me at the Clemens with a Z Instagram page. All right, you guys. Thanks. Until next time. Peace.